just want to very quickly welcome Spencer Overton, who is the Patricia Roberts Harris Research Professor of Law at George Washington University Law School, where he also chairs a super important project, which I want to mention. He's the founder and faculty director of the Multiracial Democracy Project. Welcome. Thank you so much for doing this. I'm so sorry about the technical.
Thank you. No, we're okay. It's the anti-technology issue here, right? In terms of going back to paper. So good afternoon. It's great to be here at Yale Information Society's projects Tuesday Law and Technology Speaker Series. You know, I want to start out by thanking ISP's executive director. Okay, well, we're good here. All right, sounds good. I'll take that here. So Chinmay Aaron has been just great. We had wonderful dinner yesterday. Appreciate the invitation. Also, Dr. Maria Angel for her substantive engagement and Heather Branch for her logistical support. Obviously need to thank your fabulous dean, who has just been wonderful and just an amazing friend to me over the years here, along with Munir Ahmad, Justin Driver, James Foreman, Tracy Mears, Robert Post, Reva Siegel, David Schleiser, and Gerald Torres. All of them are good friends. Now, I'm a voting rights scholar, and over the last 5 years, I've been moving into democracy and race. You all have been thinking about these issues deeply. I look forward to your questions, your comments, to help me strengthen my work. I'm going to talk about a very current issue in terms of democracy and our artificial intelligence. While deepfakes receive the bulk of the popular attention, I think they're just the tip of the iceberg. My thesis is that generative AI and related technologies will have significant implications for racially inclusive democracy, or what I call multiracial democracy. So I define multiracial democracy as a liberal democracy with a racially diverse population that meaningfully and equally protects the political rights of individuals in all groups. So at the ratification of the US Constitution, as you all know, the US was a multiracial society, but we weren't a multiracial democracy. The US Constitution subsidized slavery through various provisions. Most states limited voting to white males. The Naturalization Act of 1790 limited US citizenship to free white persons, effectively gerrymandering our population in a way that continues to affect us today here, right? So yes, we had a real attempt to build a multiracial democracy in the aftermath of the Civil War. That was short-lived. Now, over the past 6 decades, the US has moved toward being a multiracial democracy thanks to 2 laws passed in 1965. We all know about the Voting Rights Act, which allowed many more people to vote through various provisions. I think equally important was the Immigration and Naturalization Act of 1965, which explicitly barred racial discrimination in the immigration admissions process, and as a result, the percentage of immigrants in the US from European countries dropped from 75% in 1960 to only 11% in 2016. People of color have grown as a share of the population from about 15% in 1960 to over 40% in 2020. Obviously, you all know the demographic trends. People of color have grown from being less than 1% of the members of the House and Senate in the 1940s to over a quarter today. Now, race, though, so this is the diversity piece. I'm sorry, I was slipping here a little bit. So, race does matter here. We've become more diverse. Our party politics have become more racially divided. Race is the most significant factor that shapes voting patterns in the United States, more significant than sexual orientation, religion, marital status, age, gender, education, class, This slide shows the significance of race in Trump's elections, but we see similar trends in other state and federal races. This is not limited to Trump here. We have also seen, in terms of continued challenges, white solidarity growing as a political identity. Political scientist Ashley Jardina found that 30 to 40% of white folks in the US identify heavily as white, believe their group should work collectively on behalf of its interest to preserve its status. She found that white identity is becoming a more salient force in American politics because some people feel like they're losing power and status due to demographic changes here. Other experts have found that racial antagonism correlates with a willingness to abandon democratic norms to maintain status. So we're at a critical juncture. And my point is, we gotta examine AI in this context, right? Like, we can't just ignore this stuff when we look at AI and say that these are in separate silos here. Most scholars have failed to do this. Now, when I talk about AI, I'm generally talking about generative and AI and related technologies such as machine learning algorithms that are used in election administration and other contexts. There's an emerging literature about machine learning being used in redistricting, and for right now, my work does not focus on that literature. Now, AI is taking over democracy. So we see synthetic media machines that result in customized email, synthetic audio, photos, video, deepfakes, et cetera. Recommender systems, which are important devices. Systems that automatically classify images. So deepfake detection tools could be an example of that here. And of course, decision systems which automate removing outdated voter registrations, authenticating mail-in ballot signatures, et cetera. Let me just quickly note that, you know, there are CS definitions of AI, and there are also legal definitions of AI. I'm gonna adopt basically an OECD definition of AI, which is a little bit broader than some folks would say, simply because OECD has influence kind of across the world and has been adopted by many places here in terms of that as a legal definition. And as a result, I'd acknowledge that some voter purges and some signature matches are basically sophisticated Excel spreadsheets and not AI, but I would say that some of these tools use machine learning technologies and are within the scope of what I'm focused on here. So now, in terms of my work right now, I've got these 2 landscaping articles I'm working on. While I had written a couple of articles about Section 230 and race before, I had not really moved into AI and race and democracy until about 18 months or 2 years ago. So I wrote this landscaping article, Overcoming Racial Harms to Democracy from AI, and that's coming out in a few months in the Iowa Law Review. So when I started writing that piece, I was trying to do harms and benefits and then some legal analysis, and I realized, you know, it's just too much for 25,000 words. So I just broke it down, the harms, then kind of moving on to the benefits, possible benefits here to racially inclusive democracy. That one I'll shop in February, and after that, I'll focus on some discrete articles on issues like privacy or existing voting laws and their ability or inability to deal with some of these problems. I just felt like you need to learn, understand kind of the landscape and the issues first and foremost, and then we can kind of go deep into some of the legal solutions that are out there. So now, starting with the harms, I'm gonna just kind of lift up 4 categories of harms that are up here. the race and information integrity. I'm going to go deeper into these as we go on. The surveillance piece, kind of the bias and entrenching racial hierarchy. We see that in other areas, but we can see it a lot here in the democracy space, and that's to a certain extent related to this last piece in terms of entrenching cultural language, racial dominance here. So let's start with this racial impersonation and hyper-nudging. We've witnessed lower tech versions of this, whether it is people passing out flyers in Black communities saying that, voting is on Wednesday or whatever, right? We saw it here in 2016 where we have Russians impersonating Black folk on Facebook, developing a following, and then right before the election saying, hey, don't go to vote, no one cares about us, let's boycott the election here. And as you see from the Russians here, in terms of that's the percentage of the US population, and they really disproportionately spent and pull together Facebook ads and pull together pages really targeted at Black folks here. And so Black folks were certainly targeted and disproportionately targeted in terms of these efforts here. So now, right now, because generative AI is accessible to so many people. We talk about natural processing, the ability to understand language here, natural language processing just is gonna, you don't have to be a country like Russia and fund things. You can be, that lone wolf in his parents' basement in Idaho who's experiencing cultural anxiety and targeting folk. While the Russians targeted broad categories of Black folks here, kind of predetermined by Facebook, generative AI may allow for more micro-targeting here. So rather than one ad targeted 100,000 Latinos here, you might be able to produce 20 different ads for different subgroups within the population here. Now, some folks would say that could allow for more persuasive and influential ads. There is some literature that says after a couple of variables that ads don't become that much more persuasive. So if you have one or two variables, race, gender, whatever, but if you just get incredibly detailed, that's not much more, doesn't have that much more effect. Actually, so there's some limitations on customization, but chatbots, studies have shown, are more effective in terms of manipulating or persuading people. One study showed that people who believe in conspiracy theories were much less likely to continue to believe in those theories after interacting with a bot that was programmed to provide truthful, corrective information, and that those gains lasted over time here. Now, while that's good news, there's no reason the chatbots can't be used for bad in terms of manipulating and dividing people, particularly along pre-existing cultural and racial lines. Now, I think there's a potential here for different tools to fuel cultural anxiety. We've seen new tools and new technologies, whether it's feature films in terms of the birth of a nation that resulted in hundreds of Black folks being lynched throughout the South. Nazis really use widely available radio that they pushed out at low cost to maintain power. The Buffalo shooter here attempted to live stream his mass shooting at a grocery store in Buffalo to inspire copycat attempts from others. So we can only imagine what white supremacists will do with this. So I want to move on here to the surveillance issues here. The issues, again, extend past deepfakes and the power of deepfakes. So local police departments contracting with AI companies to collect and analyze mobile phone location data and social media posts and engage effectively in warrantless government surveillance that really chills the political speech of people of color and their allies, and obviously other protesters that may not have kind of a racial lens here. You know, another issue is election administration, kind of entrenching a racial hierarchy through election structures. So AI is increasingly being used to automate a wide range of election administration functions, such as the purging of voting rolls, authentication of signatures to verify mail-in ballots, polling place selection, designing ballots, voice-activated voter assistance. Because of flawed data sets, some studies have shown racial disparities, such as the erroneous rejection of mail-in ballots of voters with Asian surnames here. AI could also facilitate more intentional targeting of people of color. So for example, election administrators are concerned about AI-powered cyber attacks on election offices in terms of phishing schemes, AI-powered harassment of election officials here. You know, we saw, you know, Shay Moss and some other folks in Georgia being targeted. You can only imagine what AI could do with that. And also using text generators to create thousands of nuisance record requests. So you think about FOIA type of requests on the local and the state level here, right? Now, all those are problems that affect everybody. But there are about 400 counties in the United States that are majority people of color. An attack, because of racially polarized voting, the fact that different folks are voting differently by race, an attack on a handful of county offices that serve large populations of people of color, particularly in swing states, in metro areas like Atlanta or Charlotte, Philadelphia, Detroit, Milwaukee, could slow down election processes, make voting more difficult, possibly shift statewide or national election outcomes. And, you know, it could even affect a number of places in rural areas like the Black rural South in North Carolina or Georgia, or the tribal or Latino Southwest in Arizona that actually may have fewer resources to deal with some of these challenges. So now I think this is a kind of a conceptual slide. You know, not only can AI be used in these very practical ways, but the architecture of AI foundation models here kind of fortifies political, cultural, language, racial outlooks of the past. Because AI foundation models are optimized to reflect their training data as accurately as possible to detect patterns, we should expect foundation models to reinforce stereotypes and unfair discrimination by default. That last part was a quote here. So that's why mail-in signature match verification systems have higher error rates in terms of Asian surnames, why Black folks experience disproportionately high levels of account removals by social media platforms, why AI-powered video deepfake detection systems have higher error rates with images of people with darker skin. And it's not just a narrow issue. A very small share of the world's 6,000 languages are represented in large language models. English is by far the most dominant language, and applications trained on these data sets may also struggle with language variation within English, spoken by some African Americans, Latinos, and Asian Americans. I want to lean into this. I don't have the number in front of me, but one study showed that the bulk of Spanish used by foundation models is machine translated. So it's not like a natural speaker. It's basically scraped from the web. And when it was on the web, it was machine translated into, let's say, Spanish here, right? So it's not like even great Spanish. So not only is there less volume, there is flawed languages here. So as a result, AI-powered tools that may facilitate democratic engagement, chatbots, content moderation tools, recommendation algorithms, search functions, news aggregation tools, voice assistant tools may be less accurate, nuanced, and effective in languages other than English. So I don't mean to be alarmist, but with this, we just need to make sure that AI is not simply the next step in cultural conquest, as we've seen with imperialism, manifest destiny, and forced assimilation. You know, that may sound extreme, but to the person who experienced not being able to speak Spanish at school, even on recess, or the person with a relative who was forced to go to an Indian boarding school, or, you know, Black women who may not be promoted as a result of their hair. You know, this is real here. And if the objective here is to have a fair liberal democracy where people have different perspectives and that's okay, then, you know, these tools and just their design could run counter to that. And it's just something we have to grapple with. It's not a vote against them. It's not to say, hey, we got to block these, et cetera. It's just this is an issue we got to be honest about, the pluralism issue, and grapple with it in terms of the design and function of these tools. Now, I want to turn quickly, as I'm kind of wrapping up here, towards some of the opportunities to advance multiracial democracy. Many of the functions used for harm can be used for good. We can reduce some power imbalances and address issues like racial polarization, et cetera. So some of these are obvious. I'll quickly go through them. So reducing racial inequality and political participation. Significant voter turnout disparities by race in this country. Just as a broad brush, they're about, let's say, in a big presidential election, 60% in terms of white folks, 50% in terms of Black folk, and about 40% in terms of Latinos and Asian Americans here in terms of turnout. So this is significant here. So we talk about closing these disparities through data analysis, micro-targeting, kind of bringing down the costs of organizations to engage in voter mobilization, civic mobilization of folks. I mentioned some of the problems with large language models in terms of, I'm sorry, I'm supposed to get back up in my frame here. I talked about some of the issues with regard to large language models, but these really are, there's great potential for these tools in terms of translation. So there are some things that can be done in terms of overcoming language barriers. And this is a problem from a voting rights standpoint, because on one hand, some of these tools are flawed. Like in California, the bot that the Secretary of State uses for elections can answer some questions in English that it cannot answer in Spanish, despite the fact that California is covered by Section 203 of the Voting Rights Act, which requires bilingual materials for everyone. So I lift this up to say, this thing is built on language. Many LLMs are built on language, and this language issue is significant in our country in terms of voting participation, just in reality, but also as well as the law in terms of Section 203. So there's some opportunities, there's some costs, we gotta recognize those. Hey, we can do a lot in terms of inclusive election administration here. Often election officials don't have resources to look at audits in terms of what worked, what didn't, that kind of thing. What's the best place for a polling location to be more inclusive? I said I wouldn't talk about it, but I will. Some people are starting to use these tools to identify election districts. So basically, Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act says that when you can draw this is an oversimplification, when you can draw a majority-minority district and there's racially polarized voting, you should be able to do that. And some scholars, you know, the law says you should do that. Some scholars have said that it is easier to identify where those districts are as a result of machine learning tools here, right? Expanding the agency of grassroots organizers here. Mancur Olson talks about kind of the cost of large group collective action, right? And using some of these tools to kind of help grassroots folks coordinate, reduce the risk of shirking on collective commitments, building common knowledge. You know, there's some potential here. In terms of reducing racialized disinformation, obviously with content moderation tools, you talk about more inclusive and civil discourse here. It's already being used, could be used more. Cross-racial deliberation here. Helene Landemore has a piece about can AI bring deliberative democracy to the masses. Certain countries use a platform Polis here that tries to identify differences between people, but also similarities, and brings together different people from different groups around common issues. There may be some potential to really, you know, confront polarization and find some commonalities here. And then reducing inequality in government. So we often hear less, politicians often hear less from folks who don't have a lot of resources, right? And some of these tools can assess the sentiment of underrepresented constituents, identifying disparate impact here and reducing that impact. It's already being used in tools to regulate financial institutions, identifying more equitable, inclusive policy solutions, and kind of analyzing different pieces of legislation and doing that. And then there are a lot of people who qualify for government benefits, but are not signed up and aren't in programs. And so increasing access to and the quality of government services. We talk about, Andy Perlman has written a lot about expanding access to higher quality legal representation in terms of AI for folks who don't have resources, and not just in the criminal context, but in the civil context as well. So how do we start to address some of these issues in terms of solutions? I don't have like a silver bullet. I don't have one legal provision. I don't think there is one. I've kind of moved toward principles initially. I'm kind of following the lead. You remember that the White House came out with its AI Bill of Rights first, which was more principles-based, and then it kind of moved into the EO about a year ago. Similarly, I'm really focused on principles here in terms of anticipating these harms and acknowledging them to democracy, dealing with this AI bias issue and also kind of the pluralism issue that I mentioned, dealing with racialized disinformation and polarization. Let me just say this. I didn't really appreciate this because I'm not a privacy person. Just the really significance of privacy here and data privacy in the context of race and racialized disinformation here. And so I think that privacy solutions have to be an important part of it. And then, you know, meaningful enforcement and accountability, you know, limiting 230 immunity in this context, et cetera. Want to just move quickly to some principles to maximize some of these AI benefits. Just quickly here, we got to overcome some real barriers here. Like, there are real private sector impediments to using AI to benefit multiracial democracy. Companies don't always have an incentive to do this. They don't have the incentives to deal with the bias issues, the data privacy issues, the transparency issues with their products in terms of the black box issue. You know, many of them aren't very diverse places, so when we talk about cultural competency, that may be lacking. There's also this big tech capture here. Do we want that of democracy? Right now, about 4 companies control 85% of generative AI models here. About 3 companies control 2/3 of the world's global cloud infrastructure here. So you could easily see these companies either shaping our discourse in a way that benefits them, and even if they don't, you can see politicians who are chilled by the fact that these companies have power and chilled from kind of real regulation of them. So we also want to incentivize pro-democracy applications in terms of government incentives here. And then finally, just maintain this healthy skepticism about the benefits. Not like this isn't like the elixir or the magic potion that's going to make everything great. Obviously, there's some great things about social media 20 years ago for democracy, but there were also some real costs. So just being clear-eyed and open about that. So with that, let me stop. Thank you for your patience. I'm sorry we got started a little late. That's completely on me in terms of getting my notes over to folks later and to being dependent on some paper. But, you know, that's just me. But why don't we kind of open it up? And I know there's a break that's coming up. So what time is the break? Has the break already occurred, or how do we do that?
There isn't a break. I'm just giving you a heads up that some of the students may leave for class.
Okay. Okay, sounds good. So let's stop. Let me stop there and just let's open it up and let's talk and let me learn.
Had one. There's no one else. Thank you.
Yes.
This was a lot to take in, but I loved it. And I also really like that you're foregrounding the first order barriers before getting to the AI problems. I'm curious about how you're envisioning the pro-democracy AI applications, both from this slide and the one before. Are you thinking that they will come from the public sector or public and private? I was wondering if you had develop that a little in terms of who does it, how do they make sure that the democratic deficit is addressed?
Yeah. So I think one of my concerns is that there won't be incentives within the private sector to build tools to facilitate it. Like, that's one of the barriers that I see toward the end in terms of that. Some people have talked a lot about, public interest AI, and I'm definitely okay with that concept. I just don't know that the public sector has the resources and the expertise to do it. And so I think from my standpoint, like, all tools are on the table. So certainly public interest AI has some value, certainly disclosure has some value, but I think we have to kind of go back beyond, right? Those two kind of light regulation tools. And the analogy I often make is, okay, half of our exports in the first 6 decades of the 1800s, right? So we know what they were, right? It was cotton, and it was displacing India and China in terms of the world's cotton markets here, and we became a superpower quickly, really a lot of resources. But we didn't really regulate and prevent this real negative thing in terms of slavery, which haunts us today. Same issue in terms of the Industrial Revolution with regard to emissions and climate here, and we're dealing with these issues today. I just think a law has got to play a role that, yes, there are some big benefits here, but, law has to play a role in regulating here. And just one more point, I really do want to hear from folks, but Someone from Google once said, hey, we can't afford not to move forward, right? There are all these benefits, right? And when he said that, I immediately thought about this story by Derek Bell about space traders. And basically, space traders came, these are aliens, they came down and they landed and they said, hey, US government, we can solve all your problems and give you all this energy and, you know, medical technology, so there'll be no more sickness. All you gotta do is give us your black people, right? That was the deal. And people actually voted to do that, right, in terms of the story, right? And so, yes, we want tools that allow for societal good, but kind of the distribution of the costs, they are important, and we've got to grapple with those in terms of the distribution of the costs in terms of AI, right?
So, thank you very much. Really interesting. This is totally not my field, so I really learned a lot, and I really appreciate it. I had a question. It seems like the areas you were covering, sort of, one was kind of the abuse, the ways in which people can be abused, and then there were the benefits and opportunities as well. And then part of it, like especially your example about the way Spanish is used in large language models, and also the kind of, I don't know, homogenization or the fact that
Right.
those seem to be sort of structural or technological or something.
Yep.
So I was just wondering, in the way, the remedies or the way to address those might be different in terms of laws versus, so I was just wondering, are the AI technology people interested in addressing these kind of, what I would call sort of more structural problems? Do they recognize them? Do they want to do something about either the homogenization, if that's the term, or the inadequacy of being so English focused, like, or are they the same as the other problems? We need legislation or some external mandate to make them work. And assuming that even makes sense, but I just found it all very interesting.
So the answer is yes, they are aware. So both scholars are aware, and when I say scholars, I mean like real scholars, computer science scholars, right? Not these law professor scholars, right? No, but so technologists are aware and kind of grappling with this and recognizing that the pluralism problem is a real problem here, and they're kind of starting to try to come up with models to deal with this issue here. So there is some literature out there. And then I also think the argument would be that, you know, the Gemini issue with George Washington that kind of made headlines, I think, was it the Black George Washington, or there's another one with like Black Nazis or something like that, right? Like, I think that that's an attempt to deal with the problem that ended up, you know, with some hiccups, right? And I think that people latched onto that in terms of attacking so-called woke AI or trying to deal with this problem. So I think that companies are trying to deal with it here. They're starting to try to grapple with it. There are some missteps. And I do believe, unfortunately, this is becoming politicized in the same way the social media debate has become very partisan. You know, kind of the anti-content moderation, this is just free speech here, you know, the net choice cases and the laws in Texas and Florida, you know, versus almost the Mari Matsuda words that wound here of content moderation. And hey, yeah, we couldn't diversify and we couldn't apply the First Amendment in a way that prevented wounds, but with these private platforms, we should be able to, right? This kind of critical race theory comes to big tech kind of approach here, right? So my point is simply that I think those same debates are manifesting themselves in the AI context here. And so, you know, the question is, how do we get ahead of them? And that this just doesn't kind of devolve in a heavily polarized debate. Right.
I really appreciate this talk. Thank you. My question is following up on that. Like, when we try to mitigate the bias that's in AI data, it seems like there could be two options. One is that we try to reflect society how it is, like exactly how it is, and one is that we try to reflect how society like ought to be. So I'm wondering what your thoughts are on that, on those two options, and also who gets to make those choices. Is it like the companies themselves, is it the government, is it like us, people who vote on it?
Yeah. So I think this is kind of like the nurse problem here, right? In terms of the AI nurse problem, in terms of what do you get back, in terms of the picture of nurses here. And do you want to reflect reality, or do you want to have this kind of normative piece in terms of the way things should be? I think it's a real tension, and it's not easy, and I don't mean to completely punt. I will say, I think that average folks who are not technologists have to be involved in that discussion, and that's not a discussion that is exclusively the province of people, who did, computer science in undergrad, right? So I think these are the things that we have to work through and figure out, and that's part of it. I do think there's definitely a role for the private sector in this. I think that there's a role for government, and obviously we've got to figure out where the First Amendment fits in terms of all of this here, but I just think that there's not a silver bullet. This is a complex issue. These are the next set of issues that we've got to really acknowledge and grapple with, right? Yeah.
Thank you so much for speaking with us today. I guess in a sort of similar spirit to the previous question, with many of the harms, or some of the harms you discussed being cultural, both in terms of like previous or like sort of discussing entrenched cultural dominance, but then also bias embedded currently in the tech industry, because the sort of issues that you're focusing in on in a very helpful way are cultural. I guess in the scope of the benefits of AI to advance this inclusive democracy, do you envision AI being able to address these? If not, how would this also, how do these sort of cultural facets mitigate the effects of AI to advance an inclusive democracy, despite like any sort of like legal?
Give me your last point there, just the last point.
So because of these cultural,
right.
Because of the fact that this reflects society in the way that it is, is sort of any actions taken by the private sector or even from a legal standpoint, how would these impacts or these harms that you're identifying in some ways mitigate the effect of any steps taken to advance?
Right. So I think that there are some people who would be abolitionists, right? They would basically just say, hey, there's no way we can deal with this. There are culturally insensitive folks who are making decisions here. Our best bet is to just be abolitionists, to be against AI, to not be about regulating AI, but just to stop it. That's not where I am. I mean, I think that those people play a very helpful role in terms of centering the debate so that there's some people who are open to regulation and open to law, right? So I'm not saying that those folks don't have a role and that, they shouldn't be a part of the discussion. But I do think that, there is hope here in terms of companies playing a significant role and the law. So I'm not a doomsday person that these problems are so big that we should just focus on some other things. They're plastics. It's a big problem. We got to deal with it here. I mean, we may not be able to reproduce as human beings as a result of the plastics problem, right? But that doesn't mean we should just yield. We got to figure something out in this moment. And I think that I have the same approach and thinking with regard to these challenges. I do think that recognizing the complexity of these problems in terms of market incentives, in terms of the fact that Congress lacks often the incentives and the competence to regulate in this space, et cetera, that is a part of us getting to some solutions, recognizing the barriers that are in front of us here. And again, all this stuff is new, and a lot of the work that I'm doing is trying to landscape what are the issues and what are the issues maybe other people aren't seeing or highlighting. We got to get them on the table, and then we can kind of break down particular problems with some legal solutions and go deep on those. To assume that this whole issue is going to be addressed by like one law review article or one legal provision is, I think, naive here. Boom, and then boom.
Yeah, thanks so much. Just go off what you just said and maybe back to Chinmaya's first question. I mean, so you said just now that like a lot of the stuff is new, but actually really the thrust of your talk is that most of the issues are really being exacerbated.
Right.
They're not emerging.
Right. Right.
So I guess I'm just curious, within existing election law, there are, sort of forms of procurement built in for purchasing things like voting machines, right?
Mm-hmm.
We've had like technology, right, the mail, part of voting since, voting was a thing.
Right.
So what is it then about the existing way that we think about technologies that are used in the voting process? Is it that they don't go far enough? Is it that they just treat technology as something that's knowable or simple like the mail? What is it about the kind of technical nature, and do we need to expand that wholesale, or do we need to just reimagine it completely? Because in many ways there has been technology throughout the history of voting.
Right. I think that there has been technology throughout the history of voting. I would say what's different is the ubiquitous nature, the fact that you've got these natural language processing tools that allow various folks, to a certain extent, they democratize good activity, but they also democratize bad activity, right? So I think that that is something that is very different now than before. There's also this push in the voting space, and I'm really conflicted about it, that's like an anti-tech piece, like, hey, let's go to completely paper ballots, like only hand counts, no machine counts, et cetera, right? So there is this heavy anti-tech piece, and I don't know that I trust that. And I also think that, many of you are familiar with ERIC. It's an electronic registration consortium, here, information consortium. Basically, people were concerned about fraud, right? And often that fraud was maybe unfounded, I would say, from an empirical standpoint. But the thought was, hey, let's have the different states get together so they can compare their voting rolls and clean them up, et cetera. So that happened, right? Policy response to that. But now, like, several states have abandoned ERIC and, are claiming it is corrupt somehow here, and they're kind of setting up some of their own programs. I say that to say that maybe it's not the policy that is undergirding the motivation of people. Maybe there is a cultural piece that's going on that we kind of have to recognize that is there. So I think that you're right in terms of these problems are pre-existing. I do think that these tools exacerbate the problems, and we can't look at the problems of these tools absent the core cultural piece here. So I do think technology's always been around, but I don't know that things have moved as quickly in terms of democratizing all of these kind of opportunities for folks to do things. So I think that could be different. And I'd invite you to shoot me an email and press me harder on that, because I think it's, it's a good question, and I need to think more deeply about it here. Yep.
Yeah, everyone else, thanks for a really excellent talk. My question's on like transparency, particularly for tools in the democratic system, and kind of implications for AI particularly. So the truth is, right, generative AI is a black box.
Yep.
Like not just like almost like uniquely so, even compared to like decision trees and machine learning or deterministic machines. So I guess like the question is, like, are there any use cases that you see that we absolutely like categorically need explainability, and until we have any kind of explainability in a meaningful sense beyond the platitude, like we shouldn't let AI systems into them?
Yeah. So there's a scholar at DeepMind, and he's just like, you've got to keep AI as far away as democracy for as long as possible because of the black box nature of it, and that so much of democracy is based on trust. and that there's this lack of confidence right now, and the last thing we need is AI here. You know, Larry Norton at the Brennan Center has talked about, you know, AI starting to be involved in terms of reviewing ballot counts and other things and different types of learning tools. And so I think that that's a good question, and I haven't thought about where I would draw the line. This is maybe too much information, but to have influence, I really want to engage people in terms of there's some solutions and we can move forward, right? So I haven't basically drawn this kind of bright line in terms of being against particular applications, because I want to acknowledge the problems, but try to figure out some solutions here. Sometimes, and maybe it's just I'm too close to DC, but I do feel like sometimes folks who are just completely against something are just ignored and not listened to, right? On the other hand, there's sometimes people who are strong. You know, people would have thought 15 years ago, Elizabeth Warren and Jamie Raskin were completely out there, and now they are incredibly important voices in DC that, you know, are standing up for both economic and democratic principles in different ways. So, you know, so I think good point, good question. I haven't said there is something that is, we should keep AI away from machine learning. I think in part because, you know, frankly, if we can find some better polling locations as a result of using some tools that are more accessible, I kind of want to do it, even if we can't, even if there's a black box aspect to it, right? Even though we can't completely explain it. So I'm really kind of more focused on this outcome here of what we're trying to do, as opposed to a category. But you know, and please email if there's some thoughts that you have about what you might keep AI completely away from in the way that ESN would. Yeah?
I've been doing work having to do with a lot of these same sort of issues coming up in AI use in medicine and healthcare. I am very grateful for the people who are targeting other areas, because there is an incredible amount of overlap between what the issues are, regardless of where you're looking at them. So the same sort of things are coming up here in bail bonding, and credit predictions, and all kinds of areas. And so as you're talking about democracy, and as I've talked about, this leads me to asking you two questions that I don't yet have good answers to. I may never have good answers to, but you may have some thoughts that would help with that. One is, given the broad nature of the ways in which these kinds of things play out in so many different sectors and so many different applications, do you think it's better to target remedies to particular areas, or do you think a more general approach would be helpful, such as, say, the OPE? And second is, in terms of legal remedies, you've given us examples, and we all know of examples where they've used legal approaches that in fact exacerbate these problems, intentionally. So how would you help shape law in a way that achieves the kinds of things you'd like it to achieve, rather than moving things in the other direction? Those are the questions. Just a really quick footnote on transparency and accountability. I would also add IP as a reason why you can't get more transparency, accountability, and so on. But I know I've just asked some very broad things, and I'm hoping you will have some kinds of thoughts that would help
So-
in addressing those.
So just very quickly, and those are big questions and you can't answer them all, but I think there are always going to be these tensions, like the IP issue that you mentioned here, right? There are questions right now, there are tensions, and this is more technology than AI, but automatic voter registration, right? There's a significant tension between privacy and accessibility in terms of folks. So I just think that in these areas, there will be tensions, and that's kind of part of what we do as lawyers in terms of dealing with those tensions. In terms of the general principles versus kind of the specific answers, I'm really like both type of thing. So in other words, I'm not a believer that we're going to have the one AI agency that deals with everything and everybody else can just kind of move on and continue to do what they're doing. I think that there needs to be some distributed expertise in terms of across agencies and the government here. Obviously, it doesn't help, the court scale back to Chevron and some other things, we got some other issues we got to deal with here, right? But I do think distributed expertise is really important. That said, like this privacy issue, I think that really transcends a particular category. The privacy principles really affect us in various contexts. So I just think that there are going to be some basic principles that we have that we kind of have to grapple with that transcend. And so I'm sorry that's not a simple answer, but I just think that we're on us being at the beginning of this next stage. We just have to acknowledge there's complexity, not be overwhelmed with it, and figure out how do we step ahead. Other people who have dealt with other challenges in the past, they kind of took it step by step as opposed to there being a silver bullet, that dealt with it, right? That's the work we do.
I think acknowledging the complexity, saying there are no simple answers, taking an incremental approach
Right.
is what I'm hearing. And I think that's really the best we can do with this.
Yeah, I think so. I think that's right.
Thank you for a terrific presentation. One thing I wonder is that as you're talking about regulation, what do you see that could be the role or the impact of the EU-AI Act? And what we can learn from that? What does it bring to the US?
Right.
Or does it bring anything? Is it something totally isolated that we should disregard? Or I'm just wondering, how do you see what is the
So a couple things.
impact and value of it?
Yeah, so I think like the Brussels effect is real. I also hear that there's a Silicon Valley effect that may be out there as well, I hear. But
Scholars
right.
arguing for the Brussels.
Right. So,
Neighbor, I guess, from MIT, that's
right. So I think that is real. There are a couple pieces here though, right? Like number one, we can't be perceived as we're doing nothing in this space because we're captured, because we're making money off of this. This contributes to our GDP, and so we just let folks do whatever they want to do, right? Like there is a role for law. I do think to a certain extent we benefit from kind of the EU and their work. I think something else though that's real is that the global majority, right now, stuff is focused on Brussels in terms of a lot of activity, maybe a little bit in the US. And I think that the global majority, we need to design regulation in a way that, kind of facilitates life for the global majority. So I definitely think EU plays a role. I'm glad they're there. I think that hopefully that we can figure out a way to help move things along in the US. I think that this big issue is trying to figure out the role of the global majority in the debates in DC and Brussels and other places, so that there is a role, and what is their role in terms of shaping the future, as opposed to everything being set right now by Brussels and DC.
You mentioned a lot about the Privacy Acts, and
Right.
I'm just thinking like the GDPR, which is still applicable
Right.
as long as you do business in people who have their domicile in the EU or targeted for
Right.
So I'm just thinking that how does the US future
Well-
regulation look like? How
Well,
would you?
But see, I think that there are a lot of companies that just basically say, from a volume standpoint, we're going to basically use the same practices we use in Europe, right? Like, I mean, sometimes they deviate when it costs them, but I just think a lot of times they basically just say, we'll just go ahead and design our systems and our structures to comply there, right? And so to a certain extent, I think that we benefit from it in the social media context here. I haven't figured out the application in terms of the EU AI Act.
So you think it's more within the regulations instead of like international organizations like WTO or others who could take acts?
Yeah, I don't know, I'm certainly open to, your thoughts about it. If anything, I'm relatively provincial. And when I say I'm relatively provincial, what I'm saying is that here are some problems that I think that people have overlooked, both in the United States and around the world in terms of these technologies, and I want to shine a light on them. So I've been necessarily kind of, very focused on them. I think I have kind of rejected, sometimes you go to big companies and they're like, we're international companies, we got to deal with everybody and we can't just deal with you. And to me, that's unsatisfactory, right? That's unsatisfactory to me. It's unsatisfactory to the people who in Brazil who are experiencing unique problems. These are big companies who are making a lot of money and they got to figure out how to deal with these various challenges rather than just externalizing the costs of their tools onto these different communities. Yeah.
Okay, definitely take this with a grain of salt. I have no idea if it might be helpful.
Yep.
But I think for me, I do appreciate the landscape approach that you're taking, and I know that you want to be very broad, but I wonder if it might be worth it in sort of the conclusion or in some sort of conclusion to try to signal or identify, like, okay, we can look at disinformation, we can look at political participation, we can look at, participation in government, but if there's somewhere that I think we should start, it's probably here. This is some primary value that, like, I'm not gonna give you any solutions right now, but for the people who are going to come up with solutions and think through how to deal with this,
Right.
this might be the primary thing to focus on because
Right.
it's going to inform an approach that would develop in this way, and that's gonna probably help us deal with these other aspects of the problems. I think, even if you don't wanna commit to trying to think through all this, because that would be
Yeah.
ridiculous and hard, impossible for one person.
Right.
Signaling to some extent a starting place and
Yeah.
a reasoning behind that could be a good way to like propel that conversation of like, look at this landscape I've given you, and now other people who should be doing this work, like there's somewhere that you can begin.
Right, I got you. And I think that is a very good point, and I certainly accept it and take it, even without the salt. I will say that, in March, I think that's definitely my task. Like, once I get this benefits piece out, the question is substantively, where do I now focus and go deep? Now that I kind of landscape harms, landscape benefits, the two big things that are on my mind, at least at this juncture, are the pluralism problem that I mentioned here, and how do we grapple with it? It's not just the AI bias, but the pluralism issue, because I think that there's kind of a democratic theory question that kind of intersects with the technology challenge, right? Which is what makes it attractive to me. And then the other question that I'm playing with, if I do instead, is the privacy piece. Like, what is the role of privacy in terms of race? Anita Allen, who's at Penn, has a really good piece on privacy and race, and how do you kind of move that into the AI space in terms of what that means. So those are, and what does that mean from a law and regulation standpoint as well. So I think those are the two areas that are most attractive to me next in terms of like digging in and going deep here, and also like, what's the relationship between that stuff and democracy, voting, political participation, agency, voice, that kind of thing. But appreciate the point here.
There was a question back there. I don't want to go to the second.
Oh, no, you're good. I was deciding if I wanted to ask her or not. So I can get behind having a kind of government-generated base model and then having domain experts fine-tune the model based on their own domain-specific data sets. But I'm just curious kind of what steps you would take to create that representative data, because I assume there's a lot of disparate populations, people that are not easy to reach. So like, what are the first steps that these domain experts would take to do that?
Yeah, is it Bruce Slicer? How do you pronounce Bruce's last name? Schneider, yeah. At Harvard, has kind of gone deep in terms of the public interest AI. And I just really honestly don't think it's like a panacea, right? I mean, I just think, I don't say that it shouldn't be done, but I just don't know that it solves a lot of problems because of the limitations of government from both a resources and a technical standpoint. So I'm definitely open to it. And then obviously, how do you ensure that, you know, some public model isn't kind of fine-tuned for nefarious purposes, et cetera, that kind of thing, to the extent there's some open source aspect of it. So in terms of where you start, also, there's obviously a politically contested piece of that because Jim Jordan, I guess, you know, the head of the Oversight Committee in the House is going to have a completely different understanding about where you start than where Jamie Raskin, who's the ranking member on House Oversight, says that you should start, right? So I do think it will be fraught from a public interest AI piece here. That said, I'm not of the notion that we should say it's unworkable and we shouldn't do it. I think it's kind of one tool in the toolkit that we can approach. But I think that there are all these issues about, okay, where do you start? What are you focused on? You know, what data do you use? I mean, I think there's a lot. How do you build a foundation model? I mean, I think that there's a lot and big questions in terms of a public interest AI. Okay, well, I think I'm going to be around for a minute, so thanks so much for your patience and being here, and appreciate the engagement. Please, I benefit so much from feedback, whether it's the feedback on the harms or the benefits piece, which I'm sending out in late January, early February. So any feedback would really appreciate thoughts y'all have, okay? Thank you all so much, appreciate it.
Professor Overton for doing this, because he's also Professor plus in addition to doing the academic work. There's all these other really important things that he's doing. So thank you for taking the time out to share this fascinating, but again, like super important project with us.
Thanks for having me.